is the cleanest of clean finishers from the best on the planet.
It's time for the biggest sports stories.
Liverpool, the champions of Europe, are top of the world.
The biggest interviews.
That such a great spectacle is ruined by such thuggish behavior.
And all the analysis right here.
He's the one player that has the arrogance to think that he can play in any stadium in the world and any pitch in the world in front of any player in the world and take them on.
Every weekday, it's my sport, it's your sport. It's ZiFM Sport. Let's join the team for the biggest show in the world of sport on ZiFM Stereo. My station, your station.
It's a very good evening, Zimbabwe. It is a Thursday evening, meaning that it's time for our Power Profile. Last week, we began the exciting edition of looking at the three ladies that have transformed women's tennis. The three ladies, arguably considered the greatest of all time, there being Martina Navratilova, who we looked at last week. Today, we take a look at Steffi Graff, and then next week, it'll be the turn of Serena Williams, arguably the greatest of all time. Spending 377 weeks as number one player and winning 22 Grand Slam singles titles, Steffi Graff certainly has a case. We'll find out if she really does from the ZiFM Sport team. They are Mike Madoda, Chris Midzi, Shonta Ferinyika, our producer, and my name is Barry Manandi. It's Power Profile Thursday. Let's get after it.
Hi, this is Alexandra Maseko, and I'm the national basketball team captain, and you're listening to ZiFM Sport.
Well, as we said at the top, Steffi Graff spent 377 weeks as the number one player in the world and won 22 Grand Slam singles titles. She retired from tennis in 1999 and had a golden slam, which means that she won all four major competitions and an Olympic gold in one calendar year. She certainly can stake a claim, Mike, to being the greatest of all time.
Yeah, I think when you confine careers down to just the singles, I think Steffi Graff for me is the best women's tennis player that I've ever seen because of what she's managed to achieve and also her exceptional dominance. We talk about dominance, but if you just check out some of the things that she was able to achieve, she reached 13 consecutive major singles finals, okay? Let that sink in. Yeah. 13 finals spanning 3 years featured Steffi Graff in them. That's from the 1987 French Open through to the 1990 French Open. She won 9 of them. She won 5 consecutive major singles tournaments, the 1988 Australian Open to the 1989 Australian Open, and 7 out of 8 in 2 calendar years. That sort of dominance is unheard of. Not from Navratilova, not from Serena Williams. This was Steffi Graff playing her best tennis, and arguably the best tennis we've ever seen from any lady in the sport.
And Mike makes a compelling case, Chris, when you certainly look at those the dominance in the singles game, and it went on for long periods of time. I mean, even if you look at her statistics of staying at world number one, it supports the claim. And it's a career that you could see was going somewhere special because of the time that it started. She started very early in her life.
Yeah, she started playing pretty early on. She had a racket in her hand when she turned 4, and she was learning how to handle the racket, how to swing. She won her first junior tournament when she was just 6 years old. And this is someone who was born in 1969. Her career spans all the way into the late 90s. So it's a very long career, a very illustrious career. And I think it's also credit in part to the person who put the racket in her hand, and that was her dad.
Her dad, of course, playing the role of coach, and Steffi Graff's turning professional, get this, in October 1982 at just 13 years and 4 months of age. And a few weeks later, she became the second youngest player to earn an international ranking at number 124. So a career that started early, but also a career that into her teens, she was already winning Grand Slams, already performing at the highest level, and very early on. In fact, almost as it was providence. She won her first Grand Slam against Martina Navratilova, the woman arguably she took over from as being the next big thing in women's tennis, Mike.
Yeah, absolutely. She didn't have it easy. In fact, when you take a look at Steffi Graff's emergence on the pro scene, on the pro circuit, she didn't exactly storm onto the scene. She actually suffered defeat after defeat, especially to Martina Navratilova and Chris Evert, who dominated her initially. So she learned the hard way to persevere, to hang in there, to stick in there, to not be discouraged, because these pros were now nearing the end of their illustrious careers. She knew that her time was coming. She put in the hard yards on the court, in the gym, and it paid off with a dominant career. The other thing I want to just touch on, I know Chris talked about her, getting a racket in her hand when she was 4 years old, winning her first tournament when she was 6 years old. That was back in Germany. But she had to go to the United States of America. And this is the case ever so often with many pro tennis players who have come out of Europe and other nations, out of Japan, out of China, out of Australia, that you have to make the personal investment to take your child, to take your athlete, to take the prospect into an environment that offers enough of a challenge for them to progress to become a world beater. So it looks like America was the scene. It still is, for sports like tennis, for things like swimming, athletics, you have to go into the right environment, which is competitive enough for you to fine-tune your skills so that it sets you up for the eventual Grand Slam victories that will come your way. And that is exactly what Steffi Graff did. If she had been in Europe, just playing in Europe, and not rubbing shoulders with Chris Evert, not rubbing shoulders with Martina Navratilova, not losing to those players and not learning from them, she wouldn't have had the career that she went on to have.
And of course, that poignant victory over Martina Navratilova came at the French Open in 1987, where she claimed her first Grand Slam. And fittingly, it was against Martina Navratilova that she claimed that. But as Mike points out, it was a long period of being sharpened, being hardened by losing to the likes of Chris Evert and Martina Navratilova that made her into the great tennis player that she became. And a great tennis player, largely, Chris, you got to say, and I completely agree with Mike that America is the place to be, where you can sharpen your skills, where you can become better at your craft. She sharpened her craft and had a unique style of playing, her forehand being her biggest and most potent weapon.
She had an incredible forehand, and many actually consider that to be the best forehand that the women's game has ever seen, and she'd hit it with an unorthodox action, but she could also generate tremendous space and spin as well. And she was, in terms of her style of play, an all-out aggressor. She was aiming for the lines with her ground strokes all the time, and she approached the net a fair bit at Wimbledon, but primarily she was a baseline player for majority of her players. So absolutely solid. Her backhand was solid as well, but mainly as a slice.
Her backhand solid, but mainly as a slice. And I'm going to come back to that forehand and the baseline play, Mike. It was almost the forerunner, the forebear of what we see now in the women's power game. Before there was Serena, before there was Naomi Osaka, you got to say there was Steffi Graff.
Oh, you're so right, Barry. I mean, Steffi Graff was the forerunner of that power game that we see that is dominating the women's game in the modern game. If you take a look at most players right now on the WTA, they've got something of a power game, most of them baseline players. But what made Steffi Graff especially potent was that she just didn't rely on that. She had an all-round game. So she had the serve, she had the return, she had the volley, she could come up to the net, she had the ground strokes, she had the backhand, she had the slice, but what was her main weapon was those ground strokes, Barry, where she would shift you from side to side, end to end, and before you knew it, she was hitting the winner down the line. So one thing you didn't want from Steffi Graff was to have her pin you down at the back of the court, because once she got those strokes going, I mean, it was only going to be one thing, Barry, after that. I mean, you didn't know whether you were coming or going, and she was always going to score big.
Indeed, a Grand Slam was coming for her, and you were going out of tournaments invariably when she had you pinned back at the back of the court, because a great baseline player indeed. Let's hear from Steffi Graff's good friend on tour, Renee Stubbs, who gives some insight on the kind of champion Steffi was.
Oh, God. She's probably one of the most clumsiest people I've ever met. Just has to find the one table to hit, or the one chair to kick, or the one thing to fall over in the room. She's so clumsy. She's very shy. She's a very inner person. One of the first times I ever met her, she never had any photos up on the wall of her house, and I was surprised. I thought that she would have one or maybe two photos up of winning the Grand Slam or her first Wimbledon. And I mentioned that to her, and she said, I don't need that. I don't need it all on the walls. I have it in here.
Interesting insights there, Chris, from Renee Stubbs, talking about the fact that on court, Steffi Graff was an absolute machine, and fair enough to call her the German machine.
Fair enough to call her the German machine. And that's what she was. She was absolutely dominant on the court. I think what separates her a little bit from other players, besides just the dominance on the court, is that we didn't hear a lot from her across her career in terms of interviews, in terms of just getting to know Steffi Graff, the person. That never really happened. She wasn't into the interviews and the limelight. She did have her relationships with the other players, but she was definitely not interested in anything beyond her performances on the court.
Mike, when we talk about rivalries, and it's always good to look at rivalries in tennis, you look at some who say that Monica Seles was going to be greater than Graf, albeit for that stabbing incident. What's your take on that one?
Yeah, it's difficult to dismiss that because Monica Seles was a really good tennis player and one of the few women that we saw able to dominate peak Steffi Graff. She was able to go blow for blow with Steffi and she was able to get victories versus Steffi, which was very difficult because Steffi was at the very top of her game. The incident that led to the demise of the rivalry is really one of the most unfortunate incidents in world sport because Monica Seles, as we all remember, she was then stabbed in the back at a tournament in Hamburg in Germany by a psychotic Steffi Graff fan named Gunter Pasch, who came out of the spectators gallery and stabbed Monica Seles on the back during a changeover at her chair, and it was during a quarterfinal match at the women's tournament in Hamburg, and that's what actually halted what would have been a fascinating rivalry because these were two players. I mean, to equate them to football would be to say this was peak Messi and peak Ronaldo. They were that good. And so that rivalry was cut short. So all we can do now is speculate as to could Monica Seles have gone on to upstage Steffi Graff? She had the potential because if you take a look at the stats, they were nearly evenly matched. Before the stabbing, they had played 10 matches. Steffi Graff, of course, the more dominant player, she had won 6 times, and Monica Seles 4 times. But at that time, Monica Seles was the number 1 player in the world. So she was doing the business, because for you to be the best in the world, it's not just about you beating Steffi Graff. You know how last week we talked about the fact that Martina Navratilova certainly was the leading light, but yet Chris Evert had a better record against her in terms of their head-to-head. Same thing with Monica Seles. I mean, she was getting beaten here and there by Steffi Graff, but in terms of her dominating the women's circuit, she was dominating the women's circuit. She was the world number 1, and she looked like they were going to have, that topsy-turvy rivalry over the next 3 years, but we were denied by some foolish fan.
Cruelly robbed of the opportunity to see just how far Monica Seles would have gone, and indeed how big the rivalry between Steffi Graff and Monica Seles would have been. Now we can only speculate. The one, I suppose, a rivalry we can call it, but in truth it was never that. It was more a subplot was between Steffi Graff and Gabriela Sabatini, who, strange twist, ended up as doubles partners, Chris.
Yes, this rivalry, we'll just call it that because we don't have a better word for it. But they also had, I think, a special relationship because they did partner up from time to time, and they partnered up quite successfully. They've got 5 tournament victories between when they did partner up. And also, I think their biggest victories were in the year 1988 in Wimbledon. But when the stakes were highest, Steffi Graff was particularly successful against her. They head-to-head, Steffi Graff 29 and Gabriela Gabriela Sabatini 11. So it was a rivalry, but also a really great partnership and to some extent a friendship as well.
But I'll tell you one area where Gabriela Sabatini certainly had the beating of Steffi Graff, Barry. It was in the looks department because Gabriela Sabatini was an absolute killer. She was a stunner, a very beautiful woman. And I just don't think she knows how many young boys in Zimbabwe she inspired to watch tennis back in the days of World Sport International, as well as Gillette World Sports Special. We all watched so that we could catch a glimpse of Gabriela Sabatini when the tennis highlights came on.
Oh my goodness, Gabriela Sabatini. I mean, lots of boys went.
And the name just rolls off the tongue as well. You know, it just does something to you. Gabriela Sabatini.
As the young boys in question roll down memory lane.
A lot of young boys slept soundly at night, Chris, as a result of Gabriela Sabatini. But Mike, you got to admit that Steffi Graff in the numbers stake. When we're talking about Grand Slams, we're looking at Margaret Court 24, Serena Williams, and then of course we've got Steffi Graff sitting on 22 Grand Slams. And if we're just considering Grand Slams and then taking her entire body of work, why? And I'm not going to ask you why she should be considered the greatest of all time. Why is Steffi Graff discounted in that conversation?
I don't know. I think it goes back to what we talked about last week. The current generation has got currency. And when you're Serena Williams sitting on 23, that becomes the story because she's got an opportunity to go to match the record and then go one better. And so that'll always be the story because right now you take a look at a lot of the media folk. There are people who are probably they were youngsters when Steffi Graff was really at her peak, so they never got to experience how good she was. They never got to watch much in the way of Steffi Graff in action. And so when we talk about her dominant performances, her dominant displays, her ground strokes, that forehand, they don't know what we're talking about. They've read about it, they've watched some highlights here and there on YouTube, but they never lived through the experiences that the older generation went through with Steffi Graff. The other thing, Barry, that also counts in her favor is when we talk about her 22 career Grand Slams in comparison with Serena's 23 and other players that are there, she won those Grand Slams in a shorter time period.
You're right.
In a shorter time period and retired when she was arguably at the peak of her career. She retired when she was ranked world number 3. Serena Williams right now has prolonged her career significantly, trying to win number 24. She hasn't won a Grand Slam, I think, Serena, in the last 4 years or so. And so that's another thing that we don't talk about enough in terms of Steffi Graff, that she won her Grand Slams in a far shorter time period than the other individuals that we're talking about.
Guys, before we wrap up, it'll be remiss of us not to hear from the woman herself. So let's hear about Steffi Graff as she reminisces about her achievements in the year 1988.
Extremely special. I think I didn't realize at that point how special really it was. I was 19 years old and winning my first Grand Slam the year before and then suddenly winning 4 in the same year and topping it off with going to Seoul and winning the gold medal. I mean, it just was overwhelming really at that point, you know. I think it helped me a lot being young and kind of naive and not really being aware so much of the moment.
1988, the year that Steffi Graff achieved the Golden Slam. Of course, all 4 Grand Slams and, of course, Olympic gold. A golden moment, golden year for a golden player, and with a heart of gold as well, Chris, because when we look at her personality, her interventions on society, she is a person with a big heart, but doesn't like to be in the limelight, or didn't like to be in the limelight as much as others, perhaps.
Yeah, she didn't enjoy the limelight. She was almost avoidant of interviews, and to some extent the media kind of would stitch together their own stories because she wasn't willing to do anything beyond just her exploits in her actual career on the court. But she did have certain foundations that she supported. For example, in 1999, she appeared on the Wildlife Foundation calendar. And she was one of those people who loves animals. So she made a lot of her investments there. She also started the Steffi Graff Youth Center, and that was founded in 1991 in Leipzig, Germany. And also she was founder and chairperson of Children for Tomorrow, which was a non-profit organization implementing development projects to support children who've been traumatized by war or other crises as well. So she definitely had a big heart, and she was quiet about these exploits, which I think just adds to that.
It adds to the charm, doesn't it, Mike? And that charmed Andre Agassi. He says that when he saw her humility, he was smitten.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was a high-profile wedding, wasn't it? A high-profile hookup. Two of the best tennis players getting together. It's something that people didn't see coming. It's something that people certainly didn't anticipate, because Andre Agassi, the guy who wore black at Wimbledon, broke all the rules, the brash, young, cocky American, they would have expected him to probably find a partner somewhere out of the United States, but he chose Steffi Graff, it's a relationship that people, I think, also were cynical about. They didn't expect it to last, but it has stood the test of time.
Andre Agassi, the rebel with a cause, husband to Steffi Graff, who we've been looking at. And to say that Steffi Graff will be remembered forever by the history books would be an understatement. But she compiled a staggering career that surpassed everything that came before it, and had the most legitimate claim to being the greatest of all time, the GOAT, until Serena Williams. She comes up next week.
Hi, this is Benjamin Locke. I'm on the Zimbabwe Davis Cup team, and you're listening to ZiFM Sport.
We leave you with our play of the day on Throwback Thursday, and in fitting style, we pick a track that has something to do with Steffi Graff. In fact, it's called I'm in Love with Steffi Graff. It's by actor Hugh Laurie. And if you don't know Hugh Laurie, he's the guy who plays the main part in House MD, the TV series, where he plays the eccentric Dr. House. This track could fit on Wacky Wednesday, but here it is on Throwback Thursday. Steffi Graff, done with her. Serena is next. For now, may God richly bless you. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Anandi, out.